There is a stretch of desert in Abu Dhabi where, right now, in nearly 40 degrees Celsius of heat, crews are pouring concrete for a facility designed to do something the sun physically cannot: shine at midnight. Not a metaphor, not a line from a press release. An engineering fact: 5.2 gigawatts of solar panels charge 19 gigawatt-hours of batteries during the day. And at night, those batteries discharge a full gigawatt of continuous power. Roughly what a small nuclear plant puts out, from nothing but rows of lithium boxes sitting in the sand. And here's the twist that's going to keep you watching. The contract to build this thing was supposed to go to one Chinese company. Instead, it got split apart by two other Chinese companies now fighting each other for the right to own the energy future of an entire region. This is happening right now, in 2026, and it's only the opening round of a war that will decide who actually controls electricity in the Middle East for the next 30 years. If you're curious how countries that ran on oil for centuries suddenly became the battleground for lithium batteries, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Let's get into it. Solar power has one problem that no amount of engineering on the panel side can fix. The sun sets every single day, without exception, and with it, an entire solar plant's output drops to zero at exactly the moment demand spikes. When people get home, turn on the air conditioning, and switch on the lights. Energy engineers call this intermittency, and it has been the single biggest barrier holding back renewable energy for the past 30 years. This isn't because solar panels are bad. Solar has real, honest advantages. The fuel is free. Panels get cheaper almost every year on an exponential curve, and you can build them almost anywhere, from a rooftop to a stretch of desert the size of a small country. But handing an entire city over to a plant like that for 24 hours a day isn't possible. You need a backup that keeps the lights on while the panels sit dark. And historically, that backup was almost always something that burns: gas, oil, or coal. For the Middle East, a region sitting on roughly a third of the world's proven oil reserves, that wasn't just a technical choice. It was the entire economic logic of the state. Why would Gulf countries rush toward batteries when they have a bottomless backup generator under their feet? One that also brings in hundreds of billions of dollars a year in revenue. But the United Arab Emirates has a plan called Energy Strategy 2050, a formal commitment to reach net zero by mid-century. And inside that plan, engineers hit a wall of pure math. No matter how many solar panels you install, without a way to store their output overnight, you can never fully replace fossil fuel, only offset it for a few hours a day. Masdar, Abu Dhabi's state-owned clean energy company, publicly called this the biggest barrier facing renewable energy for decades, when it unveiled the project meant to solve it once and for all. In January 2025, the idea of storing solar power in batteries isn't new. Grid-scale lithium-ion storage was already being tested in the early 2010s. The problem was never the physics, it was the price. Early industrial-scale storage systems back then cost somewhere around $1,000 per kilowatt-hour of capacity. At that price, building storage on the scale of a power plant was economic suicide. The battery alone would cost more than the solar plant it was supposed to back up. So for the better part of a decade, storage got stuck as an expensive lab curiosity, fine for a pilot project of a few megawatt-hours somewhere in California, but completely unworkable at national, let alone regional, scale. Early batteries also had specific, ugly weaknesses. They handled heat badly. Lithium cells engineered for the temperate climates of Germany or northern China degraded far faster than promised in places where asphalt hits over 60 degrees Celsius in summer. The electronics controlling those batteries, the battery management system, or BMS, amounted to a separate tangle of wiring and sensors nearly as complex and expensive as the battery cells themselves. And it was usually the first thing to fail. And the cells themselves, built on expensive nickel-cobalt chemistries, depended on scarce cobalt mined mostly in politically unstable regions of Africa, making the entire supply chain fragile and unpredictable on price. For years, both the Middle East and the rest of the world looked at batteries as an expensive, temperamental add-on to real energy infrastructure. An interesting experiment, never the foundation. It was close to conventional wisdom in the industry that gigawatt-scale industrial storage was a story for 20 or 30 years down the road, not something happening now. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the breakthrough of the last 5 to 7 years wasn't one brilliant invention out of a lab. It was 3 specific physical shifts stacking on top of each other at the same time, and together they collapse the cost of energy storage by something like 10 to 20 times. Step 1. A change in the chemistry itself. The industry shifted en masse from expensive nickel-cobalt-manganese batteries to lithium iron phosphate cells, known as LFP. LFP has lower energy density by weight, meaning it's heavier per kilowatt-hour. But for a stationary battery sitting in a container in the desert, weight barely matters. Nothing there needs to drive or fly. In exchange, LFP contains no scarce, toxic cobalt, is far more thermally stable, and essentially doesn't ignite when damaged or overheated. A critical property when you're talking about a wall of thousands of battery modules baking under direct desert sun. That's exactly why both CATL and BYD shifted their storage systems almost entirely onto this chemistry, reserving pricier nickel-based cells mainly for premium EVs, where range per kilogram still matters. Step 2. Manufacturing at a scale the world had never seen. Chinese companies built gigafactories so large that the cost per kilowatt-hour collapsed to a fraction of its former price, simply through bulk raw material purchasing, vertical integration from lithium mining through refining, and fully automated assembly lines. BYD, for instance, is already pushing sodium-ion storage batteries, a chemistry that uses 0 grams of lithium, toward a price of around 4 cents per watt-hour, roughly $40 per kilowatt-hour at the cell level. For comparison, that's about 25 times cheaper than 2013-era systems. CATL, in parallel, has been developing its own industrial storage platform called Tenor, which the company markets as holding its rated capacity with almost no degradation over years of continuous operation. Step 3, and this is the elegant part specifically for desert conditions. Instead of protecting the battery from heat with an expensive active cooling system, engineers redesigned the whole unit as a single sealed industrial module. BYD packs 10 megawatt-hours of capacity into one standard 20-foot shipping container, officially rated to operate between -30 and +55 degrees Celsius, sealed to IP66 dust and water resistance, essentially airtight against sandstorms and direct desert sun. And by tying together hundreds of these containers through a single energy management system called GC Master, capable of coordinating up to 15 gigawatt-hours from one station, the company says it cut the complexity of the battery management electronics by 70 to 80% compared with earlier generations. That's the whole trick. Once you look closely, nobody reinvented the battery. They changed the chemistry, changed the scale of manufacturing, and changed the physical form factor so that the old weaknesses, heat, sand, cost, fragile electronics, simply stopped existing in exactly the conditions that used to make them fatal to the whole project. Now, the specifics, because none of these percentages and megapascals mean anything without a real facility rising out of the sand right now. At this exact moment, in Al Dhafra, Abu Dhabi, the project is called RTC, Round the Clock. It broke ground in October 2025 and is expected to reach full operation in 2027. 5.2 gigawatts of solar panels, plus 19 gigawatt-hours of batteries. The largest combined solar and storage facility ever built, designed to deliver 1 full gigawatt of continuous, round-the-clock baseload power. Total project cost sits at $6.1 billion, of which $5.1 billion is debt financing from a consortium of banks spanning Abu Dhabi, mainland China, Hong Kong, Japan, and France, including names like BNP Paribas, Société Générale, and Standard Chartered. And here's where the real drama kicks in. When the project was first announced in January 2025, the contract to supply all 19 gigawatt-hours of storage looked like a foregone conclusion for CATL, the world's largest battery maker. That same month, the company announced a 19 gigawatt-hour partnership with Masdar, backed by $6 billion in investment. The expected outcome: the market's biggest player takes the decade's biggest contract. That's not what happened. In May 2026, a 7.5 gigawatt-hour order went instead to Sungrow, a solar and inverter specialist out of Hefei that was, at the time, still preparing its own Hong Kong IPO. Then, in early July 2026, the remaining 11.275 gigawatt-hours, more than half the entire project, housed in a 1,644 megawatt battery park, went to BYD. Combined, those two orders add up to 18.775 gigawatt-hours, nearly the entire storage capacity of the project. CATL, the company that had looked like a near-certain winner 18 months earlier, walked away with nothing. And here's the part worth getting right. This is not a loss for China as a country. China wins either way, because all three companies fighting over this contract are Chinese. This is a war inside a single country over who becomes the primary electricity supplier for an entire region for decades to come. And it's far from an isolated case. Just before the Masdar decision, BYD also signed a separate 12.5 gigawatt-hour storage contract in Saudi Arabia. CATL, having lost the flagship Abu Dhabi contract, almost immediately signed a 10-year partnership with Beijing Hyperstrong Technology to supply up to 200 gigawatt-hours of batteries between 2026 and 2028. And on the day the deal was announced, Hyperstrong's shares jumped 20%, hitting the daily trading limit, while CATL itself gained more than 7% on the Shenzhen exchange. The scale of this race shows up clearly in the broader market numbers too. Over the first 5 months of 2026, CATL held 40.2% of the global EV battery market. BYD held 14.4%. Together, 54.6% of the entire global market controlled by 2 Chinese companies. Of the world's 10 largest battery makers, 7 are Chinese, together holding 72.6% of the market, and steadily squeezing out South Korean and Japanese rivals like LG. In the separate segment of grid-scale energy storage rather than EV batteries, CATL alone holds a 30.4% global share and has ranked number 1 for 5 straight years, while roughly 2/3 of all installed energy storage capacity worldwide is now manufactured and deployed by Chinese firms. For CATL, this is no longer a side business. In the second quarter of 2026, net profit rose 42% year-over-year, driven specifically by its energy storage division, which now accounts for nearly 20% of total revenue, up from just 2% 5 years ago. Company leadership has stated openly that it expects energy storage to make up half of all sales by 2030, eventually overtaking the EV batteries that made CATL famous in the first place. For Masdar, the RTC project is only the opening move. The company already has more than 65 gigawatts of renewable generation deployed worldwide, with an official target of 100 gigawatts by 2030, a scale that would make it one of the largest energy companies on Earth. But it's worth pausing here and being straight about something. This race looks impressive from the outside, but underneath it, it's a far more brutal, thin margin, and risky business than the headlines suggest. First, this is a war fought on shrinking margins, not just technology. Yale Zhang, managing director at the Shanghai-based consultancy Automotive Foresight, has pointed out that competition in energy storage became inevitable precisely because EV battery makers are hunting for a new growth engine as China's own EV market slows down, which means price, not pure technical superiority, is becoming the primary weapon in this war. According to Zhang, even wealthy Gulf states tightly control costs, and their storage systems need reliability within a fixed budget far more than they need maximum energy density. That's pushing all 3 suppliers, CATL, BYD, and Sungrow, into a spiral of undercutting each other. Even CATL's own storage segment margins slipped from about 25.5% to under 24% in the first half of 2026, despite revenue in that segment nearly doubling. A price of 4 cents per watt-hour isn't only an engineering achievement, it's also a symptom of serious overcapacity inside China's own battery industry. Second, there's a concentration risk that rarely makes it into the press releases. Roughly 2/3 of the world's energy storage manufacturing capacity now sits physically inside China. For the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that means their energy security for the next 30 years will depend on a narrow set of battery suppliers from a single country. Arguably the same kind of single-source dependency they're trying to escape by moving away from hydrocarbons in the first place. That's not a hypothetical risk on paper. It's a direct, concrete consequence of how fast and how completely Chinese firms won this race against Western and South Korean rivals. None of this erases the fact that the technology genuinely works, or that the facility in the desert is physically rising on schedule. It simply marks the honest distance between what's already been proven in engineering and contracts, and what these buyer nations still have to weather economically and geopolitically over the decades ahead. Which brings us back to the bigger picture this whole story has been building toward. Countries that spent nearly a century building their wealth, their influence, and even their national identity on exporting oil, are now pouring billions of dollars into a technology that, by design, makes them less dependent on their own oil at home, and buying that technology from a country that went from student to the world's dominant supplier of energy infrastructure in barely a decade. The world that ran on oil didn't announce its own ending with a headline. It just started losing ground to something cheaper per kilowatt hour, more reliable on a spreadsheet, and physically impossible to blockade with a tanker in a strait. Abu Dhabi is building a facility in the desert that literally turns daytime sunlight into round-the-clock electricity. And the fight over who supplies the batteries for it isn't really East versus West anymore. It's playing out inside China itself, between a handful of giants that together make more than half the world's batteries, and are now competing to redraw the energy map of an entire region. So here's the question worth sitting with after this video. If Gulf states are willing to hand nearly all control of their future energy infrastructure to a single foreign source of technology just to escape dependence on their own oil, does that actually make them more independent? Or is it just a quieter version of the same old dependency, with a different supplier's name on it? Let me know what you think in the comments.